It's 6:17 p.m. on a Tuesday in the not-so-distant future. You're sitting in your living room. The news anchor is mid-sentence. Something about troop movements. Something about escalating tensions across 3 continents. All at once, the screen goes black. The refrigerator stops humming. Your phone shows no signal. And somewhere in the back of your mind, before the fear sets in, before the panic crawls up your spine, you think this must be a technical failure, a transformer, a downed line somewhere upstream. You think this is an accident. It wasn't. Here's what nobody tells you about the opening hours of a Third World War. The first weapon isn't a missile. It isn't a cyber intrusion, exactly. It isn't even a soldier. The first weapon is a balance sheet. Bond markets and central banks decades before tonight. The ledger made this possible. And the ledger has been screaming the warning for years. We think wars are started by generals. We think they're won by armies. We are wrong. Every great conflict in modern history was started, sustained, and ultimately decided by accountants, creditors, and the cold arithmetic of insolvency. World War III is no different. And the first thing you truly notice, once the lights go out and the silence settles in, is not the darkness. It's how completely you were unprepared for this. It's how decades of financial negligence were quietly converted into military vulnerability. Tonight, you are living inside the most expensive bill in human history, and somebody else wrote the check. Let's go back, not decades, centuries, because to understand why your lights went out tonight, you need to understand what modern civilization actually runs on. Not electricity. Not oil, not food. It runs on credit. It runs on confidence. It runs on the unspoken agreement that tomorrow will look like today. Empires don't fall because their armies lose. Empires fall because their balance sheets lie. And for most of the late 20th century, the American-led Western order looked absolutely invincible. Think about it. After 1991, the United States stood alone. The Soviet Union had collapsed under the weight of its own insolvency, an empire that couldn't afford to exist anymore, not because it lost a war, but because it went bankrupt trying to fight one. America, by contrast, sat at the top of the world. It had the largest economy in human history. Its currency was the global reserve. Its military consumed nearly $800 billion a year. Its technology companies rewrote the rules of commerce. Its banks set the interest rates the entire planet paid. From the outside, it looked like a civilization at its absolute peak. Gold, power, reach, the world's greatest empire since Rome. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. While the parades were happening and the victory speeches were being written, a quiet catastrophe was compounding interest in the background. The American power grid, the literal circulatory system of the entire economy, was aging at a rate that should have terrified every policymaker in Washington. The average age of a large power transformer in the United States crossed 60 years. 60 years. 60 years. These are machines that were never designed to last that long. The American Society of Civil Engineers had been issuing infrastructure report cards since the 1990s. Year after year, the grid earned a D+, not a failing grade, something worse, a barely passing grade that nobody cared enough to fix. The cost to fully modernize and harden the American electrical grid was estimated at $2.1 trillion. That number was sitting in government reports, think tank analyses, and congressional testimony for years, and virtually none of it was funded. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 allocated $65 billion toward grid modernization. $65 billion against a $2 trillion problem. That's not investment. That's a down payment on a burning building. But here's where the ledger gets truly dark, because the problem wasn't just neglect. It was addiction. The United States had developed a structural dependency on cheap foreign manufacturing, cheap foreign debt, and cheap foreign energy inputs. And those three addictions were feeding each other like a toxic triangle. The national debt crossed $10 trillion in 2008. It crossed $20 trillion in 2017. It crossed $30 trillion in 2024. And as each new trillion was added to the pile, the political appetite for long-term infrastructure investment shrank proportionally, because debt service costs money, and money spent on interest is money not spent on steel, transformers, and hardened substations. Think about the scale of that. Every year, the United States paid hundreds of billions of dollars in interest alone, money that went to bondholders, to foreign governments, to financial institutions. That money didn't build a single substation. It didn't replace a single aging transformer. It didn't harden a single mile of transmission line against electromagnetic attack. It evaporated into the financial ether, and the grid kept aging, and the adversaries kept watching. This is where the antagonist enters the story. Not a general, not a president, a market force, a calculation. Because somewhere in Beijing, somewhere in Moscow, in the strategy rooms where asymmetric warfare is studied like a religion, analysts had been running the numbers for years. And the numbers told a devastating story. A coordinated attack on the American electrical grid, using a combination of cyber intrusions, physical sabotage, and directed energy, could be executed for an estimated cost of between $50 million and $500 million. The economic damage from a sustained grid-down event across multiple states? Estimates ranged from $1 trillion in the first week to $10 trillion over a 3-month period. That is the greatest return on investment in the history of warfare. The asymmetry was staggering. It cost billions per day to maintain traditional military operations. It cost almost nothing to turn off the lights. The adversary didn't need to match American military power dollar for dollar. They just needed to find the one wire, the one system, the one invisible dependency that the entire civilization rested on, and cut it. The ledger had already told them exactly where to look. The descent didn't begin on the Tuesday evening when your lights went out. It began years earlier in a series of escalating provocations that the financial press covered as investment risk stories and the defense press covered as security briefings, but that almost nobody connected into a single coherent narrative. In 2021, the Colonial Pipeline attack demonstrated that critical American infrastructure could be shut down with roughly $4.4 million worth of ransom-level hacking. The attack caused fuel shortages across the East Coast within 72 hours. The total economic impact exceeded $4.4 billion. That's 1,000-to-1 return. And it was a test run. In 2023, physical attacks on electrical substations in multiple states caused cascading outages affecting hundreds of thousands of customers. Investigators found no sophisticated technology involved. Wire cutters, rifles, basic tools. The substations cost tens of millions of dollars to build. The attacks cost almost nothing to execute. The vulnerability wasn't a secret. It was published. It was studied. And still, the investment to harden those substations never fully materialized, because hardening a substation doesn't win elections. And debt-financed democracies have trouble funding things that prevent disasters that haven't happened yet. By 2025, the geopolitical pressure was building along multiple fault lines simultaneously: Taiwan, Ukraine, the South China Sea, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East. Each theater was a separate line item on the global balance sheet, bleeding resources, attention, and political capital from every major power. The United States was carrying its military commitments like a man carrying too much debt, still functional, still formidable, but increasingly stretched, increasingly brittle at the edges. The intelligence reports were explicit. Multiple foreign state actors had pre-positioned malware inside American grid infrastructure, not to attack immediately, but to wait, to watch, to understand the topology of the system in granular detail. When the moment came, they wouldn't be guessing. They would be executing a plan that had been years in the making. A plan funded at a fraction of the cost of a single aircraft carrier. A plan made possible entirely by the financial negligence of the target. The smoking gun exists, though you won't find it in a newspaper headline. It lives in a classified annex to the 2019 assessment by the Department of Energy, the part that was never declassified, the part that described in clinical detail what a coordinated, multi-vector attack on the high-voltage direct current interconnects would look like. The report described the scenario as not a question of if, but when. It described the recovery timeline as measured not in days, but in months, potentially more than a year, for full restoration. It described the death toll from secondary effects, hospitals losing power, water treatment plants going offline, supply chain collapse, as potentially exceeding battlefield casualties by an order of magnitude. The people who read that report requested funding. The funding request went through the budget process. The budget process weighed it against deficit targets, political priorities, and quarterly electoral calculations. The money was not approved in the amounts requested. The grid remained exposed. The adversary remained patient. And the ledger has always kept the score. Somewhere in the hours before 6:17 p.m. on that Tuesday, a coordinated sequence of events was triggered across 17 states simultaneously. Malware that had been dormant for years activated inside industrial control systems. Physical teams executed strikes against high-voltage transformer yards in 6 critical locations. Transformers that cannot be manufactured domestically in meaningful quantities. Transformers with lead times of 12 to 18 months from foreign suppliers. That is not a coincidence. That is a supply chain analysis translated into a military targeting list. The gold was gone from the supply chain. The credit was frozen in the financial markets. The Allies had turned inward toward their own crises. The moment your lights went out, the United States economy began hemorrhaging at a rate that no military response could stop. Every hour without power costs the economy an estimated $18 billion to $22 billion in direct and indirect losses. Factories idle, cold chains collapse. Financial transactions halt, supply networks seize. Every hospital on backup power is burning through diesel reserves. Every water treatment plant running on battery backup has a countdown clock above it. Every pharmacy refrigerating insulin, vaccines, and temperature-sensitive medications is operating inside a shrinking window before the medicine becomes unusable. Sovereignty is solvency. A nation that cannot keep the lights on cannot project power. A nation that cannot keep the lights on cannot sustain troop movements, cannot coordinate logistics, cannot maintain the command and control infrastructure that modern warfare depends on. The military, ironically, had hardened its own critical systems, but the civilian infrastructure that feeds, powers, and supplies the military machine, largely unprotected, largely underinvested, largely running on the same aging, vulnerable grid that the Department of Energy had been warning about for a decade. By hour 6 of the blackout, the economic damage had already crossed $100 billion. By hour 12, financial markets in Europe and Asia had begun pricing in a full economic disruption scenario for the American economy. The dollar, which had been the unshakable pillar of global finance since 1944, was sliding, not collapsing, but sliding. And in currency markets, a slide is a warning. A slide is the ledger beginning to speak. By hour 24, the cascading failures had begun. Water pressure dropped in major cities as pump stations lost power. Grocery stores operating on just-in-time inventory systems that carry roughly 3 days of stock were being emptied within hours. Gas stations, which cannot pump fuel without electricity, became lines of stranded vehicles stretching for blocks. And hospitals, which had been underfunded for years, running on paper-thin margins, began making impossible triage decisions about which patients could be maintained on backup power and which could not. This is what the financial negligence bought. Not dramatic explosions, not the Hollywood version of war. This, quiet collapse, systemic failure. The slow-motion bankruptcy of a civilization that spent 30 years consuming its own future and calling it prosperity. The question nobody was asking in the first 48 hours, because everyone was too busy surviving, was, how long will this last? And the answer, buried in those classified reports, was brutal. The United States manufactures only a handful of the large high-voltage transformers that anchor the grid's most critical nodes. Most are manufactured in South Korea, Germany, and to a significant degree, China, with supply chains disrupted by the same conflict that caused the attack. Replacement timelines extended from 12 months to an indeterminate period. The cost of full grid restoration was estimated at between $400 billion and $2 trillion. A nation already carrying $34 trillion in debt was now staring at a repair bill that would require borrowing from the same global markets, now questioning its solvency. The generational weight of this moment is almost impossible to comprehend while you're sitting in the dark eating peanut butter by candlelight. But history will comprehend it clearly, because this is not the first time a great power's infrastructure debt came due in the worst possible moment. Britain entered World War I with the largest empire on earth, and exited it financially dependent on the United States, forced to liquidate overseas assets and take on $4.7 billion in American loans just to survive the conflict. By 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the United States simply threatened to stop supporting the British pound, and Britain's military adventure collapsed overnight. Not because of military defeat, because of financial leverage, because sovereignty is solvency, and Britain had spent both. Germany entered World War II with a war economy built almost entirely on deficit spending and seized assets. By 1944, the Third Reich was financially insolvent, printing money, looting occupied territories, and consuming its future at an accelerating rate. The military was still fighting. The balance sheet had already surrendered. The war lasted another year, but the ledger had already written the ending. The pattern is always the same. Great powers convince themselves that military strength is separable from financial strength. Then you can borrow your way through decades of infrastructure neglect and still be ready when the crisis comes. That the bill will never come due, or if it does, not on your watch, not on this Tuesday evening, not with your family sitting in the dark wondering what comes next. The bill always comes due. For the generation that grows up in the aftermath of this blackout, however long it lasts, however wide it spreads, the scarring will be as deep as any battlefield wound. The children who spend their formative years in the dark will build their adult lives around the memory. They will invest obsessively in energy independence. They will vote for infrastructure. They will understand in their bones what their parents were taught to ignore, that civilization is not a given. It is a maintenance project, and maintenance costs money. And money not spent on maintenance is borrowed time. The final check for this particular financial negligence, for the decades of deferred grid investment, the decades of underfunded hardening, the decades of choosing short-term budget comfort over long-term resilience will be written by someone who hasn't been born yet. That is the true nature of infrastructure debt. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send warning letters. It accumulates silently, year by year, budget cycle by budget cycle, until the day it converts itself into something physical and undeniable. A dead screen, a silent refrigerator, a city of candles where electric light used to be. And so here is the lesson that history has been trying to teach us since the first empire borrowed against its future. The lights going out during a world war is not primarily a military event. It is a financial event. It is the moment when the ledger, long ignored, finally presents the final invoice. Every dollar not spent hardening a substation was a dollar spent building this darkness. Every year of deferred maintenance on aging transformers was a year building this silence. Every budget fight that chose short-term, political convenience over long-term resilience was a vote for this Tuesday evening. The first thing you notice when the power goes out during World War III is not the darkness. It's not the silence. It's not even the fear. It's the realization, slow, cold, and absolute, that this was preventable, that the warnings existed, that the reports were written, the assessments were completed, the costs were calculated, and the money was spent elsewhere, on interest payments, on political priorities, on the comfortable assumption that someone else in some future budget cycle would deal with the bill. They didn't. You are.